Good evening, everyone. I'm Ryan Turner, Artistic Director of Emmanuel Music, and I'm joined by my colleagues, the Reverend Pamela Werntz, who is the Rector of Emmanuel Church, and Nathan Troup, who is the Stage Director and longtime Emmanuelite in different capacities, but he was our Stage Director for the Handel La Resurrezione that is premiering this Friday in a matter of, Saturday in a matter of 3 days, May 15th at 8 p.m. I've invited them today to talk about the biblical context of this story, specifically as it relates to the two Marys. That would be Mary Magdalene and Mary Cleophas. Um, just a little context. Handel wrote this piece, this oratorio in two parts, La Resurrezione, in 1708, and it was premiered on Easter Sunday of 1708. Now, at the time, there was a papal ban on opera during Lent, so they were not allowed to have any operatic performances. There was also a ban, a papal ban on women performing in public. So the way Handel got around this is that they had this performance in the house of Ruspoli, which was a private wealthy donor in his own home. Because there was such interest in the piece, um, it actually ended up, they printed 1,500 librettos, which is not quite a private performance, one would say, and it became public, essentially. And Handel had cast in the role of Mary Magdalene a woman. Now, as I said earlier, there was this papal ban on women performing in public, but because it was, quote, a private performance, he could make a case for a woman singing the role. Well, he must have known that that wasn't going to fly, because she only sang one performance and was replaced the very next day by a castrati, because he indeed got in a little bit of hot water, because the level of the performance the Catholic Church deemed rose to the level of public, given the number of people that were there. One of the things that's unique about the La Resurrezione is that it so often, up to this point, these sort of oratorios were either focused on the Passion story or after the resurrection. And what happens here is Handel and his librettist Carlo Capece are focused on what happens in the intervening days between the death and that leads us to the resurrection. So with that, Pam, I'd love for you to sort of help us put this resurrection story in a biblical context and help us understand how how much does the librettist follow what happens in any of the gospel tellings, how much liberty is taken, and just sort of, orient us biblically, or not.
Uh, I'll disorient you biblically.
There you go.
So one of the things Ryan hears me say often is that there's not the resurrection story. There are resurrection stories, and there are many resurrection stories in the four Gospels, also in Acts and in First Corinthians. So there are 6 books in the New Testament that tell resurrection stories that are not compatible. There are themes and threads and characters who show up, but you can't put them all together and make the resurrection story. This story, this libretto, is a kind of a midrash. A midrash is an ancient Jewish practice for filling in the story between the lines, the backstory, the motives. I often give people an example of if you looked at 2 photographs that were taken at a family celebration that took place before you were born, and you know the characters because you know your parents are in the photos, or your grandparents, or an older cousin or sibling, and you can look at those photographs, you know some things about the story about that event, but you weren't there, and you want to figure out what the motives were, what the relationships were, what the picture reveals about what might have been going on in between those 2 pictures. What happened just before the picture? What happened just after the picture? That is what Midrash addresses. And this libretto is a kind of Midrash on details of, or pictures or photographs of resurrection stories, but not just one resurrection story. In Mark, the people who are present in this period of time that this is addressing are Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, or sometimes Joseph, and Salome. And they experience the empty tomb and they go tell Peter. In Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. There are 5 other Marys besides Mary Magdalene, so we don't know who the other Mary was. And the angel tells them to go tell the disciples to go to Galilee, and that's where Jesus is going to meet them. In Luke, it's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women. And the instructions are, go tell Peter, who doesn't believe them and comes back to the empty tomb to confirm, tell them to stay in Jerusalem. So just the opposite. Tell them to go to Galilee, tell them not to go to Galilee, tell them to stay in Jerusalem. And in John, and one of our characters is John the Evangelist, but in the Gospel of John, it's Mary Magdalene alone who encounters the risen Lord. And Jesus appears to her and tells her to tell the others. So the common character in all of these stories is Mary Magdalene. The other Mary might be the same Mary. It might be Mary, the wife of Cleophas, Mary Clayofas, or and she might be the same Mary as the Mary of mother of James and Joseph, but we don't know. She is listed, Mary Cleophas and Mary Magdalene, as well as Joanna and some other women, are listed as women of means who underwrote or supported financially Jesus's mission, Jesus and his disciples. So we know that they were leaders in the church, and we know that they were connected, at least in the Gospel of John. They were at the cross with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the disciple whom Jesus loved, who is traditionally understood to be John the Evangelist, but again, we don't know. So these are the people that were in Jesus's inner circle who didn't flee when the crucifixion happened, who went to the tomb, who were the first to be told about the resurrection. What's really interesting to me about this libretto is a character that's not in the story. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, is referenced, and Mary Magdalene and Mary Cleophas are prominent figures. And the person who's missing in Handel's La Resurrezione is Peter. And Peter, is the one who got the keys to the kingdom to start the church. And the popes are traditionally descended in their authority from Peter. So the Bishop of Rome tradition is Peter was the first Bishop of Rome, and every Bishop of Rome is in the place of Peter. So it's fascinating to me that Handel is producing this, trying to evade the popes, or trying to get around the bans, and basically saying that this resurrection story doesn't have the authority of a pope in it. So that is just fascinating to me. And it took me a while to realize that what the most fascinating character, I think, is the one who's not in the story. We know that women were great leaders in the church, but the church in Rome has not always recognized that. I think probably still doesn't. It's said that women hold up half the sky, but I would say women hold up more than half the church. And this is a story about those women being the primary agents of telling that story. So I think I'll stop there, and you can ask me questions, or we can go on from here.
One of the things that you said, Pam, that is interesting is, and I don't know if you said it today or you said it another time to me, about this idea of the Midrash and these two pictures of like a family event, and how what Handel's doing is painting a musical picture, essentially. And this idea of a picture, or in this case, art, was present at the premiere of this. In fact, it was a backdrop. They commissioned a painter, Michelangelo Cerruti, a Roman painter, to paint a painting of the resurrection that had all five of the characters for the La Resurrezione. So we had Lucifer, the devil. We had Angelo, the angel. There's Mary Magdalene, or Maddalena, Mary Cleophas, or Cleophe, and then San Giovanni, or Saint John. And I thought I'd just share with the listeners, I pulled an image off that is indeed that painting. And what the painting shows, and let me just tell you quickly, is that it shows an angel. Actually, let me pull it up first, and then I can describe it as we're looking at it. Here we are. You can see that? I assume it's up there?
Yep.
So it shows an angel sitting on the tomb announcing the resurrection to the two Marys. St. John is in the distance near a mountain, and there are demons plunging into the abyss. And in Ellen Harris, our woman that wrote the Handel scholar that wrote our program notes, she talks about that it was installed with difficulty and many men, and there was also a painted tablet that gave the title of the oratorio that was fixed over the beam of the entire stage that said La Resurrezione. So, and in this picture, of course, also missing is Peter. So not only is Handel painting a musical picture, his librettist, Carlo Capece, is telling a story, a resurrection story, that has parts borrowed from many different resurrection stories, and parts left out of a resurrection story. And then there's also this painting of a resurrection story. Let me pull this down now. So Nathan, I want to just move on to you and just tell our listeners, Nathan has been involved with Emmanuel since, oh gosh, early 2000s, Nathan, was it? Yeah. He sang, he worked in the box office. He's now has collaborated on a number of projects with us. Most recently was the Britain Beggars Opera that we did at Pickman Hall at the Longy School of Music, and also the chamber series we did, the Britain Chamber series we did last fall, and now this. And I have to say, Nathan was the one that unknowingly sort of revealed to me the hidden corners and splendors of the Emmanuel Sanctuary as a theatrical venue. So, Nathan, I just want to ask you, in terms of, to me, the interesting thing about this story, you mentioned the person that's not in the story, Pam. To me, the interesting is the relationship between the angel and Lucifer, and how we see Lucifer almost human-like in vulnerabilities. So there's this sort of the heavenly and the abyss, and then there are the relationships between the humans here on earth. I could talk for a while about how Handel depicts that, but I'm curious, in your own staging of it and in the process, how you were informed by those relationships, or if it evolved as you went along.
So I think that at least in a lot of opera, there can be a very vague, well, we see this in all types of art, that there's these very polarized versions of masculinity and femininity, good and evil, as if these things are sort of like blaring signs that the world is only seen. I mean, it's one way of distilling the information or simplifying it, but we've also sort of evolved where we can process and think about much more complex dynamics and relationships in between, it's being so obvious. So in the same way, that I was thinking, and we will maybe talk about that later with the having a male singer play one of the female Marys, this idea of the angel and the devil, for lack of a better, well, Lucifer, Lucifero, seemed like we didn't need to see them at odds, and in fact, they're in the score together. And there's something more complex and delicious to me about seeing all of these people interacting and finding the things that they're afraid of getting to, but like always rushing to try to get there to find the answers. And that's what we were sort of using in terms of how these two characters and all of them related to each other, why they would come together and why they would sort of, you know, be forced apart, what that tension was and what the magneticism was between them that was keeping them together, which felt like a much more visceral sense of the world and these forces that are in our world.
Yeah, maybe I could jump in and just say that in scripture and in church tradition, Lucifer as a light bringer is an ambiguous character. And Jesus actually gets this, the term gets applied to Jesus in the Exultet, which is the Easter proclamation that happens at either at sunrise or after sundown on Easter, on Holy Saturday. But the light bringer or the morning star are what Lucifer is in mythological tradition. So Lucifer is not, it becomes a stand-in for the devil, but that's not all Lucifer is.
Yeah.
In scripture.
And I think that's a perfect example of, you know, in a way needing to advocate for all the characters. No one wakes up starting their day saying, I'm going to be horrible today just to be horrible. There's always a reasoning, a coping. There's a, you can get to the point of why it's there. So yeah, that's very interesting, and that's exactly what it is. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense that we would have such spectacular music written for a character that was never going to be identifiable, relatable in any way. No one's interested in just hating someone and disliking them for that extended period of time.
Right.
Well, and musically, I think of Lucifer's very first aria. It is, even in the opening ritornello, before he sings a single note, there's so much that happens in the articulation and in the musical landscape that, to me, takes Lucifer's character, and you can sum it all up in these first 16 measures. In that there's some thorniness and there's some elbows and, you know, sort of staccato-like accents in the orchestra, in the strings. There is some incredibly gorgeous music. There are places where it feels a little slimy. It's like you can hear in the ritornello all the different temperaments of Lucifer working things out. And then, of course, he sings all these exact same musical figures. But again, the music is incredibly appealing. So why give it to a character if he's just bad? And Nathan, I was going to go back to something you said about male and female and, you know, angel, devil, bad, good, this sort of binary choice. And I think that's what you were driving at. If you can say a little bit about the casting of Cleophas as a male.
Right. Well, you know, there is a tradition in theater and in opera of whether it's castrati or men playing female roles in Elizabethan theater, it can get so tangled to think like, okay, so this is a role, the character is a female played by a man whose voice is actually in a higher tessitura that would sound more like a mezzo's, and then we're actually going to cast this man to play the role that's the female part, and then like, what do you do? I mean, there's all of that unwinding, but the fact of the matter is, and I think about this a lot when I work with young artists because of the idea, the tradition of pants roles in opera, and many young women who are preparing these roles still will say like, well, I need to learn, like, do I look like a boy? Am I moving like a boy? And I think there's so many more important things in terms of a human being's character fleshed out than whether or not like what their gender is. And I think we're getting to a point in time now where we're realizing that gender is this social construct, because it's actually the same young, smart, vibrant students who believe that, but are still sort of pressed to feel like, well, am I looking like the boy character that I'm supposed to be on stage? So we didn't make a big deal out of it
Yeah.
in terms of trying to sort of somehow suggest or signal to anything other than to say, I mean, no one's wearing a dress in this show at all, but even that sort of pageantry, that we dress more similar among all of us these days. Like, there aren't these signaling things that say this is a female and this is supposed to be a female. So the Marys tend to feel alike, but it's nothing that it's not uncommon to what we are experiencing today all the time. And that alone, I think, was the statement. And I share that here, but we didn't talk about it. We don't talk about it. That's not what our character conversation or discussion was about. Like, well, how does a woman feel about going into this? What woman? How does which woman feel about this situation, Chris? Like, he didn't say that at all, but I would never prompt that question. Like, who is the defining woman who you're supposed to be using as the, like, because women are a monolith, like there's only one thing that they would feel, so it's exploring gender across the entire scale, right? Across the entire thing that really gets us to these questions. And when we need to answer something that feels very specific to why is this person's gender need to be explored or addressed, or what do we need to unpack here, then you go there. And when you're not, you're telling stories about humans who are women. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that struck me in our production and watching you work and watching these characters evolve, that it was more about the relationships between the two Marys and their dynamic than anything else. And we're getting a lot of questions coming in from listeners, but I guess I can take the artistic director's privilege and keep asking my own questions. So, Pam, Mary Cleophas, if I'm not mistaken, she's mentioned only once in the Gospel of John. Is that correct?
Well, she's only called the wife of Cleophas, or Cleopas is our clunky English way of saying her name. So that she's only mentioned by that name. She might be the same Mary as the mother of James and Joseph.
Mm-hmm. So do you have, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to come up with a theory about as to why this librettist, this Carlo Capece, whose career I looked up his career, he began with a career in law and in government, and then became, later in life, moved back to Rome to become a poet, to the former Queen of Poland, who was residing in Rome, and then ended up writing librettos.
In exile, right? She was exiled. Yeah.
In exile. And he wrote a number of librettos for opera and for theater productions. And that was Handel's introduction to him, as he knew him as an opera librettist. So again, I'm getting off track here a little bit, but the idea of this was not an opera, but everything about it screamed opera.
Right. So you're wondering why he wrote her into this resurrection scene.
Yes, and such a fully fledged out character.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I don't know. I love the idea that she was at the cross. I mean, according to John the Evangelist, she was at the cross with Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the disciple whom Jesus loved. And those are the characters that all receive the news first. There's this beautiful, I mean, the completely out of gospel territory is the idea that Mary, the mother of Jesus, has the privilege of getting the news first. So that's just referred to in the libretto, that's not dramatized.
Right.
But that's lovely, right? That is a beautiful touch for a woman who has just witnessed the crucifixion of her son, to get this news first. So she's privileged with that information. And then Mary Magdalene doesn't have to be alone. She's got a buddy. And I love the idea that, I mean, it's the power of a witness. If you've got two, it's a stronger story than just one. In the Gospels, Mary Magdalene is not believed. I find it fascinating that he wrote her into this story to accompany Mary Magdalene. So I don't know why he did it, but I'm glad he did it.
And musically, I've felt as we explored this piece and learned it, so much of their relationship is, I felt that Cleophas was often trying to encourage Mary Magdalene in a way, and their speech patterns were different. There was a different rate of singing in their recitative, but it was in the, of course, the title of this is The Faith in the Marys, but there's the big turning point aria Diserati, it's Per dire, where, and I'm paraphrasing here, where Mary Magdalene says, I am afraid to go look for him, but I am strong because I know he has faith in me.
Right.
And it was that turning point in the story. And I remember, Nathan, we had a sort of table read, as it were. We read through the whole libretto that one day in the sanctuary. And there was this moment where I think Kristen said, oh, of course, a woman changed the course of history yet again.
Well, and that's right. And it is this, I mean, when we were looking for a title for our conversation tonight, I thought it is both the faith that they had in them that made them stay when the others fled, that they had faith in them in Jesus. And then Jesus and the Holy One, the divine, have faith in them. They are entrusted with this story. And so it is the faith that Jesus had in them, and the faith that they had in Jesus, and the way they support each other. There's something, I mean, Jesus sent people out 2 by 2. And so for Mary Magdalene to be alone in the gospel story and encountering the risen Lord by herself, whether that is shocking news or good news or terrifying news for her, she's got no one to hold her up. And, in this libretto, she has the companionship of someone who is going to remind her to be brave or to help her do the next thing, to go with her. It's beautiful.
It's funny. One of those days in stagings, one of the scenes that ended with the 2 Marys, we had the chance to explore a little bit, and they found each other sitting together next to each other over the edge of the stage, and I started singing with them the song from Godspell that the 2 women sing. Where are you going? Where are you going? Will you take me with you? That's sort of what's happening. You're just sitting down and with each other, I'll hold you up while you doubt.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me get to a few of the questions that are coming in from our viewers. Question for Nathan.
Mm.
What are the themes that have informed your approach to directing this production?
What are the themes?
Hmm.
Well, knowing that maybe this touches on it, knowing that we were doing this at Emmanuel Church in the city of Boston made Emmanuel Church and the city of Boston a character in this piece. And to see that we were not doing a recreation of a living nativity scene by any means, that we were going to place this, what I always have felt, it felt very, to me, Emmanuel, like looking at us in humanity right now. And so it's funny when you talk about the part of Peter and the keys and that idea, because the whole piece I was just like, well, they're both just breaking into the church or running into the church. It felt like breaking into it, but that's never what we said. But as we're rehearsing it, of course, there is so much traffic coming in and out of Emmanuel Church for so many like amazingly, and I don't even wouldn't even be able to tell you what they are, things that unrelated but somehow this crossroads, right? So seeing and knowing that we were going to use the space in that way, to use the physical space as part of the storytelling, because it really doesn't take place any one location. It's this transient sort of, I'm passing through here, let's go to the woods, you go to the garden,
Hmm.
I'll look this way, I'll go here. Oh, all of a sudden we have the angel and Lucifer having a confrontation and a dialogue, and then they sort of disperse, and where are they going, and where did John come from? So the theme was sort of capturing that feeling of a life in progress, like a busy sort of passing, that we see these characters plucked from our own stock, and they are in this journey that happens to take a little like center stage, so to speak, at 15 Newbury Street in downtown Boston. So that was sort of part of like sculpting in the aesthetic. One of the themes for the aesthetic, which I think informed a lot of people's um, uh, character development too as we went along.
So, you touched on this, but a follow-up question. Somebody asked, is there a way that the aspects of the interior of Emmanuel Church or the architecture provided inspiration or posed challenges, or even maybe became a kind of character in the story?
Yeah, I think to that extent that I had said, I think also knowing, like, I mean, I'm very familiar with the sanctuary at Emmanuel and the nooks and crannies, and it's even just like the hallway, the stuff you never see on film that we know of, but even that sort of became a part of the whole vibe. So it was never daunting to think, like, we saw the architecture and we thought we'll use the space and we'll make it just, I don't know, in a way it was like, okay, part of it's done. It was sort of like a living painting, right? Like, we're installing now these characters into this image. um yeah.
One of the things that I mentioned this, but when we did the Britain Chamber series in the sanctuary, and there were parts of the architecture, parts of the church that, when they were lit in different ways, that even though I've been around Emmanuel Church since, gosh, 1997, there were new sort of nooks and crannies of the church that were revealed to me. And um, you used the balcony in a different way. And of course, we've been sort of living in the balcony during COVID time. The singers have been. We're up there every weekend but the way it was lit, can you tell us a little bit about, and I know we talked about this before, but can you tell us a little bit about the use of the balcony and the two main moments? One, we're at the very beginning with the angel, and then when Lucifer has his big descent.
Sure. I just
And am
had
I giving it away? Is that a spoiler alert?
No, but
Okay.
I just sort of had a like aha moment about something related to this. But yeah, we used the balcony, and I don't know why in my mind it seemed like it was a bigger thing to everyone else than it was to me. Like in its novelty and its whatever, and what the aesthetic ended up being. And I was almost thinking like, oh, this is really obvious, and maybe it is, but um, it just seemed, it's sort of a place that I don't go to a lot, and I haven't spent much time up in that balcony. Like it's not an easily accessible. You can't get to it from the room you're in. It feels aloft, right? It feels sort of like you wouldn't touch it. And we didn't have rules to it like that only certain people could go up there. It was just sort of helped make a chasm, and also sort of allowed for a Greek chorus, or allowed for whoever was up there to be an onlooker, right? To see, to watch a bit of what was going on. That this was all, nothing was of complete shock and surprise to everyone, that there was this like balancing act going on between Angelo and Lucifero and really all of them. But it's interesting because about a year ago I started thinking about like making opera and doing theater, and where is that, and how does that happen now and exist? And I started thinking about my early like involvement in music was through my church and singing in the choir. And that very distinct moment, it was sitting in a balcony and looking at the cherub choir and like turning to my mom and dad and saying like, well, why can I do that? So maybe I did have like this fixation now to bring this like balcony moment that I didn't really intend, but thank you for bringing that full circle, Ryan.
You're welcome, Nathan.
And then
Question.
did it, and it's beautiful and it's really cool. There's the rest of that. It's a
There
cool,
it is, exactly.
scene. Yeah.
Pam, it says a question for Ryan or Pam, but I'm going to throw it to you. And I think you've somewhat answered this, but do we know whether Handel or the librettist were thinking about the theology of this, or was it all about an opera-like production?
I absolutely think they were thinking about the theology of it. You know, what does this say about who people are, and what do people say about God, and what do they say about Jesus, and what does it mean, and you know, what is the harrowing of hell? And I mean, I think it's all theology. I don't think there was a separate day that they said, let's talk about the theology of this. I think it was just part of the air they were breathing. I don't know if they would have been able to separate it.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly they were aware of the Bishop of Rome, also known as the Pope, and they were aware of other alternatives. You know, the Reformation had happened by that point. It wasn't, you know, the Church of Rome was not the only possibility. So yeah, I think that they are struggling with the theological questions about what happened. What does it mean that Jesus is resurrected? You know, so what difference does that make? It makes a lot of difference for the people that are freed. Now, I just had a thought and it went right out of my head.
Well, while you're thinking about that, this sort of leads to another question that somebody had, and I'll take it, about what are the somebody said, what are the most exhilarating moments in the score? And for me, and I will say that and it's in answering the previous question about were they thinking about the theology of it, and I think Handel was, and I think he does it musically. When we look at the way he is experimenting with orchestration in this piece, to me, the orchestration is a whole other character that comes alive and really. I remember, Nathan, having a conversation with you when we were doing staging rehearsals just with piano, and there was this feeling of, are we doing enough? What's happening? Is this working? And I remember saying to you, the orchestra is a whole other character. And especially, I think, as it relates to the characters in the story that are, quote, here on earth, the two Marys and John, For the devil and the angel, we have often the angel sang with trumpets and has, of course, is the highest of the voices. The devil is depicted with the lowest of voices and never with trumpets, only with stringed instruments. And it's those characters that are here on earth, the sort of human element of the score, of the human element of the theology, where there's the most experimentation. I feel like there's less that is preordained, predetermined in that way. And so for me, the exhilarating and amazing parts of the score is what I would call exotic, um, experimental orchestration. Mary Magdalene's first aria has two recorders with muted strings, and she's begging for the wings of sleep not to fold don't fold your wings, don't let me fall asleep. Basically, keep your eyes open. There's an aria with two recorders and a muted oboe that have all this thorny chromaticism, and it's the middle of Mary Magdalene's aria where she's trying to decide whether or not she's going to go search for Jesus or not. And I feel like it's her inner psyche that is sort of that she's toiling away with and struggling with all this chromaticism that's working against the gorgeous strings. So often when St. John sings, it's with a gamba, the way Handel uses orchestration to me, and the way it's his voice, his own characterization is coming in through his orchestration. To me, that's the most exciting part about the score. There's a message for any of us. Can you talk about what it means for Emmanuel Music to have this type of offering in the world we live in today, socially, artistically, and liturgically?
Well, I'll start with liturgically. Liturgy is drama. And to produce a piece of a devotional work, which is what this is. This is a story of the most important story, or the most important message for Christians, is that death doesn't have the final word, that the fallen angel doesn't have the final word, that Jesus is victorious, and that life and love are victorious. Like, to set that in Emmanuel Church, while, as Nathan said, hundreds of people are coming in and out in various states of disarray, it is to say, like, this is still alive. These questions, this still matters. And I think about that Peter Sellers interview where he talked about preparing a cantata, to sing a cantata, knowing that there's a shelter in the basement, and that there are multiple 12-step meetings going on, and that somehow made the work of preparing that music that much more real. And that's what I hear Nathan saying, as you're trying to put this together and record it, and you've got people who are coming in and out, some of them because it's a church, and some of them because it's a roof, some of them because they need the bathroom or a place to charge their phone. It's all of those things, and to do that in the sanctuary, I think, is thrilling, and the right use of space.
I will say it's a point that Nathan made, I think actually more than once, as it relates to gender and it being fluid and it being about humanity. I love your story about when you're working with a singer on a pants roll and they say, am I enough like a boy? And you say, that's the least thing you have to worry about. I think it's about addressing these relationships and seeing these people, the humanity of it, as opposed to the specificity of gender or anything else. And I will just say is, for Emmanuel Music and for Emmanuel Church to be able to be making music in this time, in a time that we're doing it safely, and that, as one of our musicians said to me, she said, what you are doing is a ministry to all of us, because we're able to do something beautiful together when there's so many impediments to being able to do that during this time. So to me, that's social, that's artistic, that's, I don't want to say liturgical, but it's pastoral.
It is liturgical, and it certainly is pastoral. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are coming to the end of our time here. And I was thrilled. We got so many questions. Was not expecting such engagement. So thanks to our listeners. And Nathan and Pam, what a pleasure to speak with you guys about this.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Nathan, I'm incredibly excited to see the final product on Saturday night.
me too.
And yeah, and I just want to remind people that are listening right now, that tomorrow night, Ellen Harris, who's a Handel scholar at MIT, who wrote our program notes, is also pre-recorded a pre-concert lecture, and that will be premiered tomorrow evening. And then Saturday night at 8 p.m. is the live premiere of La Resurrezione, and I hope everyone will tune in. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.